Good morning, everybody. Well, at least it's morning for me. I'm actually recording this on Monday morning, uh, on the day that the video is due. So, kind of last minute. I wanted to wait until I received all of the different fantasy analyses that you guys turned in so that I could share all of those with you this morning. So, that's what I'm going to do. The reason I'm laughing is Chelsea is really full of it this morning. So she's running around. So I don't know, she'll eventually probably try to disrupt my very important business here, but we'll try to persevere as best we can. Um, I work well under pressure and distractions and so on. So a crazy kitten shouldn't deter me from doing my job. So we'll see what happens. All right, relatively short video today. Like I said, I do want to share with you the fantasy analysis responses that you guys did to broaden our examples of fantasy. Of course, we did Charlotte's Web. We talked about that last time. We're going to talk a little bit about Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe today. But I wanted to supplement uh, our discussion with other examples, and you provided the examples, and they were very good and a wide variety, and a couple were mentioned twice, which I thought was interesting. But we'll get to that today. So we'll talk about your fantasy analysis. We'll also talk about the questions to Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and cover that book. And your comments and your critiques of that book were also very interesting. But we'll go over those questions. And that's pretty much it today. Let me first, though, explain our homework for midnight Wednesday before Thursday's video. So that will be class 10. So anyway, the assignment's due by Wednesday, July 23rd. And obviously watch this lecture and take note of the numbers in the sequence. And let's start with 80 today. Our first number is 80. Um, so obviously include that in the homework. You've all been pretty good at doing that. So keep doing that. All right, we are going to get into realistic fiction. So we're moving from fantasy to realistic fiction. And I have two works on tap for that. One is Bridge to Terabithia, which I'm going to ask you to read and do an assignment for this week. And then next week, we're going to take a look at, I think I mentioned this before, maybe the first day of class, my favorite book of all the ones we do in Children's Lit, a book called Wonder, also made into a wonderful movie. And so that's probably, I think that's the longest in terms of reading. Um, I think Towers Falling is kind of long too, but I think Wonder is probably the longest book of all the ones I have you read. So if you want to start getting a head start on that, you may want to do that. We're into the fifth week now of seven, so we're coming to the end, and we still have a few more books to do, obviously. But Wonder is the longest of all of them, so that's it's more than one sitting, I guess is what I'm saying. I think most of the other books I've had you read, I think you could probably read in one sitting. That is, if you don't have an animal distracting you every 5 minutes. All right, so please read Bridge to Terabithia. That'll be our first example of realistic fiction. And there are some Canvas files that are related to the book that I'd like you to read in preparation for that. There's a file called Realistic Fiction Issues that we will talk about. And then I don't want to give too much away, just in case you haven't read the book or seen the movie. And it was a really good movie adaptation done. I guess it's been close to 20 years ago now. Stars the kid who played PETA in Hunger Games. His name escapes me at the moment. But anyway, uh, one of the things I think is very, very realistically done in the book is dealing with grief. And of course, this is something that all children will probably have to go through at one time or another. At some point, they're going to lose a loved one or a friend or somebody. And I think this is a good book that kind of shows that there are all different kinds of ways of reacting to the loss of a loved one. There are different stages which have been well documented by sociologists, um, such as Kubler-Ross. And so I've included a couple of articles that I want you to read dealing with uh, well, most people call them there's 5 stages, but there's one article that includes 2 more, which I thought was kind of interesting. So please familiarize yourself with that because that's one of the things we'll focus on is how the work realistically portrays the different stages of grief. Okay. And then there are some questions that I'm going to ask you to answer in regards to the Bridge of Terabithia. I'll go to those in a minute just to show you those. And similar to the questions in wardrobe, there are a whole bunch of questions on the sheet. I'm just going to ask you to answer the ones that are highlighted in yellow, and that quiz will be worth 20 points. And then maybe most importantly, um, your author profile is due before midnight on Wednesday. Okay, so I went over this, I think the very second day of class and said it wouldn't be coming for a few weeks. Well, now it's here. So please, follow the format that I suggested that you follow. Uh, and again, there are examples of author profiles. I went over those. Uh, and all of this is in Canvas. So choose a author or illustrator in children's literature of your choice and do the author profile and then email that to me along with, oh, by the way, oh, I already wrote this down. Okay. Send it in the same email as you send your Terabithia questions, but they'll be in a separate file. And I'm going to compile all of these too eventually. So everybody eventually will have a chance to read uh, each other's author profiles. I'm not going to make it a part of the final exam. It's not something you have to study for. I'm not going to ask you about anybody's author profiles. It's just more kind of a general FYI kind of thing. All right, so you have basically 2 assignments due. You have the Terabithia questions to answer, and then also the author profile to turn in. And I gave a little bit of an extension for the fantasy sci-fi presentations, and I already have, I think, 2 or 3 of the 4 in already. But if you're in that group and you haven't turned in your presentation for your fantasy or science fiction work, the absolute deadline on that would be due Wednesday by midnight. So like I said, I think I have 2 or 3 of the 4 already. Um, but again, if you haven't turned that in and you're in that group, make sure I get that. Okay, so that's the homework for Wednesday by midnight before our Thursday video. And let me share with you. All right, so this is what I mean by the Terabithia questions. And again, there are a number of them. Well, there's 17 altogether, but I would like you to answer the highlighted questions. So 1, 3, 5, 7, 10, 11, 12, 15, 16, and 17. Just generally comprehension type questions, but also by going over by answering the questions and by me going over the answers on Thursday's video, that'll be kind of our way of covering the things I want to cover in the Terabithia story. Okay. And I think maybe the single most important question is 17. We see, well, I guess the question is a plot spoiler, but anyway, um, Jess is our main character, and he goes through the different stages of grief throughout the story, or I shouldn't say throughout the story, toward the end of the story. And so be able to apply the 5 to 7 stages of grief that you read about in Canvas to Jess and his grieving over Leslie. And I guess I just gave away a major plot point, but I think most of you are probably familiar with the story. I'd be curious to know if anybody's read that book before when you were a kid, or maybe even was it ever taught in school? Um, I don't think I read, well, it actually it came after my time as a kid. It's a classic. I think it was published in the late 70s. And by the way, keep that in mind as you read some of the story, because I think a lot of the story is somewhat dated. There are certain things that happen in the story um, that I don't think could happen today for various reasons. And that's something I'll kind of talk about in my lecture on Thursday. So, we're judging it as a work of realistic fiction, and I want to focus on how the stages of grief are shown realistically, but I'm also realizing that some of the parts of the book are a little bit dated and not really realistic to 2025. Um, so anyway, keep that in mind. So those are the questions I would like you to answer. And again, uh, just answer the highlighted ones. Okay. All right, let me give you a second number. 60, 60 is our second number. Things have quieted down now. I don't know uh, what Chelsea is plotting. Um, but like I said, she's been full of it this morning. There's nothing quite like a kitten. I think I might have mentioned she has like two speeds, either 100 miles an hour or sleeping. She's now developed a third speed, something kind of in the middle where, she doesn't demand to be on my lap, and but she likes to like lay on the sofa next to me as I'm watching TV, and she just likes to hang. So I like speed number. I like the second speed. Um, the first speed is kind of crazy, but that's what you get when you get a kitten. So you have to live with that. All right, I wanted to talk about Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which is a classic work of fantasy for children. It's remained very, very popular over the years. There have been any number of video, or I should say, media adaptations of this book and attempts to do media adaptations of other books in the series. And they are attempting, I believe, a series uh, uh, on television, producing the different books in the series. There's an article um, in the Canvas about this. I didn't assign it, but if you want to take a look at it, if you're a fan of the Narnia series and C.S. Lewis, um, I'd like to think they'll do a good job of it. I think it was 15 or 20 years ago. They did a movie adaptation of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which I thought was pretty well done. And I think they attempted two more uh, books in the series and then kind of stopped. I don't think they did movie adaptations of the entire series, but the first one was pretty good. That's the only one I saw. And so it's a classic work, remains popular today. And I think it's interesting to talk about because it is a good example of high fantasy. There's a lot going on here that can be appreciated on different levels and can be talked about on different levels. And of course, if we're talking about a child reader, I think they're just going to get, the adventure part of it and the fantasy part of it. And I think it works on that level. But for a course like this, there, like I said, there are other, dare I say, deeper things going on here, including uh, what Lewis called a Christian supposal as opposed to an analogy, which I thought was an interesting distinction. Uh, so those are aspects that I asked you about, and I wanted you to be cognizant of, and we'll talk a little bit about those. Well, right now we're going to go over the questions. Um, so let me boot those up. All right, we'll go over the ones that you talked about, plus I'll probably throw in a couple of the ones that I didn't have you do that weren't highlighted. First of all, the setting is very important in the story, and this kind of hints at the later question, That was the very, yeah, 17. What techniques does Lewis use to help make his fantasy believable? Well, the very first thing we see is that he does ground the story in a very realistic setting before, all the fantasy elements start to make themselves known, before Lucy uh, goes into the wardrobe and comes out in Narnia. Uh, and it's historically accurate and realistic. We're talking about roughly 1940. Um, Europe was in the throes of a world war. Uh, Germany was regularly bombing England and particularly London in air raids night after night after night. They had started to sweep Europe. I'm giving you a brief history lesson. Well, you get a lot of worth out of this class. You get a history lesson and all kinds of stuff. I'm figuring you know a little bit about your World War II history. Um, and they had taken over, they had invaded France and occupied France, for example. And their goal was to do the same with Great Britain, England. But Winston Churchill, great British leader, um, inspired the people and they fought back. And even though they were bombed mercilessly for weeks and months in the late 30s, early 40s. They didn't give in. They did not surrender to the Germans. And uh, of course, once December 7th, 1941 happened, that's when the United States got involved in the war after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Then we came directly to uh, the Allies' aid, to Great Britain's aid, and we entered the war. And of course, it was like almost 4 more years before the war was over. But England was kind of on its own for a while, fighting the Germans, with very little help from anybody else. And it was their finest hour, as Churchill used to say. And it's a very realistic scenario. Basically, the Pevensey family lived in the city, but had the means and the opportunity to send their children uh, to a countryside place uh, where they would be at least somewhat relatively out of harm's way, certainly not as much as in danger as they would be in London. So the parents stayed behind in the city but were able to send their children, their 4 kids, to the countryside where they would be much safer. So London was being bombed nightly by the Germans, but the Pevensey children uh, were out of harm's way as the story begins, and they were with Professor Kirky. I guess I'm pronouncing that correctly. And this is a kind of situation that could very well have taken place, and I would imagine in some cases probably did take place if parents had the opportunity and the means to send their children out of harm's way while they stayed in their homes or their apartments in the city, and they would probably have taken that opportunity to do that. So, we have a very realistic setting of World War II setting. And so the story is grounded in reality before the fantasy starts to occur. All right. Um, I didn't ask you number two, but it's kind of related to number four. Um, for my money, at least in book one, Edmund to me is the most interesting character, kind of the black sheep of the family, to use an old expression. And I think he's the most interesting because he has different sides to him. Peter is like Mr. Perfect, and Lucy's cute, and Susan is kind of nondescript. It's like, she doesn't really have much to do or say in this first book. So Edmund is the interesting psychological study. Um, and he is pretty ornery, especially in the beginning of the story. He seems very resentful. And this kind of leads into question four. Um, he joins forces with the White Witch, who is, of course, the villain in the story. And there's any number of reasons for this. You get the sense early on that he's very jealous of Peter. classic younger brother syndrome, living in the shadow of his older, handsome, Mr. Perfect, uh, voted most likely to succeed older brother. And I think maybe there might be some children readers over the years who can identify with that. I don't know if any of you can, if you lived in the shadow of an older sibling. I did to a certain extent. My older brother was popular and good in sports and popular with the girls, and then there was nerdy me. Um, I don't remember being as resentful toward him as Edmund is to Peter, but I think it's a realistic scenario. Um, it's kind of a textbook case in child psychology, I think. Um, so he agrees to help the White Witch. She employs him, um, and she, of course, is intent on capturing these four kids. She learns of these four children who have entered Narnia, two sons of Adam and two daughters of Eve. And obviously, uh, there is a prophecy that if there are two sons of Adam and two daughters of Eve, they will eventually rule Narnia and mark the return of Aslan. So she can't have that prophecy come true. So she sets out to, um, well, eventually kill these children. And the first one she employs is Edmund because he is susceptible to her appeals because he does seem to resent uh, the rest of his siblings, his older brother and his two sisters. And of course, brothers and sisters don't always get along either, and that might be another realistic scenario for kids. Um, so there's any number of reasons why he agrees to help her. She is nice at first. I mean, she doesn't show her villainy until later. She, flatters him, um, promises that if he will help her, she will make him king of Narnia. So uh, a little promise of stature, and obviously this would allow him to rule over his older brother. So that's very tempting. She tempts him, almost like a devil-like figure. So help me out, and I will make you king of Narnia. Um, Also, and a number of you pointed this out, apparently this Turkish delight is some really good stuff, man. I don't know what's in it, but he takes one taste of it and he wants more. And she says, well, I'll give you some more, but first you got to help me do some stuff. So the Turkish delight is part of her tempting, bribing, promises of wealth and fame and power, and he could lord it over his siblings. And all of these are very powerful ways of tempting somebody to do what they know in their heart must not be right. There's certainly a religious aspect to that. Um, why do people do evil things? Well, they're tempted uh, by base desires like revenge and jealousy and gluttony and ambition and all of these other things. And it's kind of shown in her appeal um, to Edmund. And again, she's very persuasive and she's very charming and at least kind to him in the beginning. And by the time he realizes just how evil she is, it's too late. I mean, there's nothing he can do. He's already left his siblings. He's pretty much under her power and control. And we'll talk about this later, but a great thing about Edmund is eventually he is able to redeem himself, which is also a kind of a religious aspect to the story. No matter what kind of evil you may do in your life, you still have a chance for redemption. And we'll talk about that in a second. All right, so Edmund, for my money, is the most interesting character, at least in the first book, because he's not like a one-dimensional cardboard sort of character. And I think because of that, not coincidentally, I think he's probably the character that uh, most readers could maybe identify with, most children readers could identify with, even though, of course, Lucy is the first Pevensey child to come across uh, the wardrobe and Narnia. Um, Also, kind of interesting, when she then comes back from Narnia and tells her siblings, Edmund is the most dubious and the most dismissive and is mean to her and like, oh, that's ridiculous. And of course, not coincidentally again, he will become, the second Pevensey kid to experience Narnia. He sees it for himself, and of course he denies it at first because he's a real, ass. But this plays into another uh, characteristic that we talked about to try to make the fantasy believable, have a doubting character in the story who poo-poos the idea, and then they actually experience it and go, "Oh my God, Lucy wasn't lying." Of course, I'm going to pretend she was because I'm an ass, but so you have that element in the story as well. Um, Helping to make the story realistic. So if a character who doubted the whole thing suddenly sees it for themselves and accepts the fact that it is real, that helps the reader suspend some disbelief as well. Um, on that same line of questioning, uh, question five, this is another way a writer can make the fantasy more believable, have a character of great stature or standing, um, validate the fantasy idea. And of course, the professor does that. He's very open to the possibility of Narnia, and even accepts it and maybe gives a little bit of advice about it. And of course, at the very end, when they come back to him to tell him about all the stuff that happened, he hints that this is not the end. That they may indeed have other adventures in Narnia sometime in the future. So um, we have the validating, respected elder who uh, doesn't dismiss the idea, actually accepts it. And again, that helps, especially a child reader, accept the fantasy aspect of it. So he's very open to the possibility. All right, a couple other things. They hear about this magical creature named Aslan, and I think it's interesting uh, that when they first hear the name Aslan from the beavers, they hear the beavers talk about Aslan, and Aslan is coming. Um, three of the Pevensey children, are kind of struck with a wonder, even though they're not sure what this is or who this is. And it's interesting, Edmund has a kind of a slightly different reaction, which again singles him out from the rest, kind of foreshadowing a little bit. They know he's on the move. The beavers tell them. Also, Narnia is like winter 24/7, cold and snowy. It kind of sounds like Cleveland. Uh, but now things are starting to thaw and the temperature is getting warmer. And that's one sign that Aslan is on the move and is coming. Um, And again, when they first hear about Aslan, the three of the kids feel a great sense of wonder, whereas Edmund kind of has a uh, sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. Um, I didn't ask you about these, but this kind of borrows from mythology. I don't know if you noticed this or not. We talked about this in the Hunger Games. We've talked about it perhaps in other stories as well. Um, Father Christmas shows up at some point. And I don't know if you think that maybe this kind of is a weird kind of insertion into the Christian allegory or not. I've had a couple of comments in the analysis from students about this, and I tend to agree. This seems to be a little inconsistent. But anyway, Father Christmas, they don't call him Santa Claus, but they do call him Father Christmas. And as in, a mythological story, each character is given something that might help them in their adventure. And this is usually a pretty good extra credit quiz question or bonus question. Uh, each of the three, well, three of the four kids get gifts from Father Christmas. But again, Edmund has already split by this time. He's the outcast. He's gone to join forces with the White Witch, so he didn't get anything. All right. But I wonder if you know this. Well, Peter gets the sword and the shield. And again, we can look at each of these as somewhat foreshadowing. If a character gets some kind of weapon or something from an outside force, a god, a goddess, in this case, Father Christmas, we can pretty much rest assured that somewhere in the journey or the adventure, they're going to use these things. And of course, Peter uses the sword and the shield in the final battle and confrontation with the White Witch's forces. Um, Susan, again, gets a horn and some bows and arrows. She's kind of Katniss before Katniss, although I put my money on Katniss against Susan. But I don't know, she doesn't really do much with these. And then Lucy, of course, gets a vial with a healing potion, which again will become very, very important and will be used at the end of the story, at the end of the battle, including her administering it to Edmund, who is severely wounded in the battle. And there's a nice little scene in the story, where she attends to Edmund first with the vial, and Aslan kind of comes up and kind of reminds her, hey, there are other people that could use this as well. So I thought that was kind of a little sweet scene. This always makes me laugh. Lucy was also given a dagger. Now, what the hell this little girl's going to do with a dagger, I have no idea. But anyway, she was given those things. And of course, Edmund, like we said, got nothing because he was the bad kid and he had already left. All right, a couple of other things. Um, there is the ultimate eventual confrontation between the White Witch and Aslan, this great, wonderful creature who has a lot of Christ-like characteristics, as Lewis intended. He can call it a supposal or an analogy or whatever, but it's all the comparisons are there. You can't deny those. And um, she thinks, though, that she's got the better of him because she recites the deep magic. All right. The witch reminds Aslan of the deep magic of the emperor beyond the sea, which says that any treachery committed in Narnia is punishable by death by the witch's hands. And of course, Edmund uh, is the traitor. And so she's going to kill Edmund, and she's within her rights to do that based on the laws of Narnia. And Aslan doesn't fight that, but instead he offers to sacrifice himself in Edmund's place, which again, the sacrificial aspect of the story is very Christ-like. Um, and you get the sense that the White Witch wanted that all along, and she doesn't really care that much about Edmund. This was a way to destroy Aslan, and perhaps she probably even anticipated that he would sacrifice himself for this kid, and that's what she wanted all along. So it does indeed seem like Aslan is killed. You have a very powerful scene. I think one of the most emotional scenes is when Lucy and Susan come upon what they think is the corpse of Aslan, and they see what terrible things were done to him, and so on. And it's a very sad and moving scene. Uh, I don't have the copy of the book in front of me. I would read some passages if I did, but I would encourage you to reread that passage. It's the whole passage with his death and then his resurrection, and the two girls witness this, and then they ride on his back to the battle scene. And they even say it was the most wonderfulest thing that they had ever experienced, riding on Aslan on his back in the sky as he had been resurrected and joining forces against the White Witch. It's a very beautifully constructed and written 4 or 5 pages there. Um, and how was he able to do this? Now, this is the one aspect of the story that I always have had a little bit of problems with, and students in the past have tried to explain to me that this also um, is true to uh, religious philosophy and the story of Christ. She thought she had him beat because of the deep magic, right? But he says, um, as we find out when he's resurrected, oh, here we go. There she is. Chelsea makes an appearance. Hey, pretty girl, you're on camera. Sorry for the interruption. Well, you're probably happy for it. Give us more Chelsea. The hell with you, Shank. But anyway, hey, you're standing on my notes here, kid. What are you doing? Pretty girl. All right, I'm going to try to carry on here. She's the deeper magic. I'm the deep magic. She's the deeper magic, aren't you? Yep. Laying on my notes. Just don't eat them. Okay. Well, she's right here now, so I better do a good job here. Well, he speaks of the deeper magic, which was a hidden law written on the stone table before the dawn of time. And I want to write, I have the notes here. Uh, it amends the deep magic by stating that if an innocent being offered his own life in place of a traitor's, the deeper magic would reverse death and restore them to life. Now, we talked about how what makes a good fantasy is that it's consistent within its fantasy world. And every time I read this, it always seems to me like, Lewis kind of boxed himself in a corner, and the deep magic killed Aslan ultimately. So what do I do now? How do I get myself out of this plot hole? Well, the deeper magic. Now, again, I don't mean to make light of this, but I had now a child reader will accept it and have no problem with it. A more mature, objective eye like ours might have a little bit of issue with that. It just seemed a little bit contrived to me, a little bit convenient that there was a deeper magic. And it just makes me wonder, in the sequel, will there end up being a deepest magic or a really, really deep? I mean, how far are we going to go with that? So, but that's how he wins out over her. She was not aware, as he was, of the deeper magic. Um, and that's how he's able to outwit her. Um, well, number 12, the most wonderful thing that happened, I just referred to that. Okay, and again, 13, they do join battle. They do join into the battle. And of course, Peter is leading the charge with his sword and shield very courageously, as you would expect Peter to do. He's kind of the heroic Pevensey. But Edmund does his thing too. He stands up to the witch and actually breaks her wand, which was turning everything to stone. And it was a very important moment in the story. It kind of turned the tide against the White Witch and her forces. If she didn't have the wand um, at her disposal, she wasn't able to do what she does. But as a result, he is very mortally, severely wounded. But again, he shows, eventually that he's capable of doing the right thing, and he joins forces with his siblings, good versus evil, and he redeems himself. So it is, among other things, a story of redemption. I'm just trying to figure out where my cat is. Anyway, um, so and I mean that's the end of the climactic moment of the story. Uh, she's tearing up things. Um, and then they are, to honor the prophecy, they are made the kings and queens of Narnia. And uh, given titles, etc. And that pretty much ends book one. They do return back home, and there's an issue with the time too. They go, they lived to be into their young adulthood in Narnia, and then to when they come back home in the wardrobe, they're back to being kids again. And I that's another kind of plot issue that I have a little bit of trouble with. I told you before, my least favorite genre is time travel. And this, of course, story plays with time. And so that always kind of leaves me a little bit cold. By the way, it seems like I'm being very critical of the book. I'm not, but that's one of the reasons why I like to choose this book because, like I said, there's a lot going on. There's a lot we can talk about, both good and, subject to discussion. So, and again, you don't have to agree with me on all my positions, but that's one of the reasons I picked this. There's a million wonderful examples of high fantasy I could have chosen, but I think this is a really good one for kids. But it also uh, is subject to a more mature conversation as well, like hopefully we're having, and your answers to these questions indicated as well. Um, so again, there are examples, characteristics of this as a Christian allegory. Aslan's willingness to sacrifice himself, of course. Um, the white witch could be construed as the devil-like figure. Uh, Aslan's return is anticipated, much like Jesus's return is by those in the Christian faith. Um, they believe that there will be a second coming eventually, and um, it's interesting too, one of the tenets of the Bible is the meek shall inherit the earth. And we kind of see that in the story. The children end up ruling Narnia, among so many other uh, religious parallels, including the sacrifice and the apparent death and the resurrection that we see in the story. Um, there are hints that there will be a sequel. First of all, the professor indicates that this might not be the end to the story. And then also, I don't know if you noticed this too, but they introduced the white stag at the very end of the story, and then nothing is ever said about it other than, oh, there's a white stag. So it kind of leads you to believe that there's going to be another story that's going to involve, among other things, the white stag. So, obviously, this is just book one as in part of a very long and very classic series of books for kids. Uh, I don't know. I think a few of you have mentioned that you have read the entire series, um, but I just wanted to do the first one. And again, I think we've already kind of touched on some of these. Um, how does he make the fantasy realistic and believable? Grounds the story in a realistic setting, has a character who mirrors the disbelief of the reader, um, has a wise character, validate the fantasy. And I think for the most part, the details are consistent within the fantasy, but I think there are a few that beg some some discussion as we've done here today. So um, 18, uh, I didn't ask you to read or answer this question, but obviously with the religious aspect to the story, there might be issues in teaching this to a class of public school students. Private schools, I think, might be a different issue. But um, and I would be curious to know, those of you who are in education, how you might handle this book if you were going to teach it in a classroom situation. Also, I'd be curious to know if anybody remembers reading this book in school and how the teacher handled this. It seems to me, you could do this book for a class of fourth graders or whatever, and just treat it as a fantasy that's interesting and has a lot of good messages and morals and so on, and maybe not even go anywhere near the fact that it has a religious undertone to it. But I don't know. To me, it seems like that's kind of disrespecting the work. I mean, regardless of how you feel about religion and Christianity or whatever, it seems to me that if Lewis intended it to be a Christian allegory or supposal, then it seems to me we're obligated to talk about that and address that. And obviously, that's where you could get into some potential issues when you talk about religion in a book, in a classroom, a public classroom situation. So it's an interesting question. It's one of those dilemmas that prospective teachers have to deal with and answer in their own way. And um, but anyway, so there are obviously some potential issues to teaching this classic book. But again, I think it works. I think it works as a fantasy, even if you don't, point out the different relationships to the Christ story. But again, it just seems to me that, we need to address that or talk about it, since that is, part of the reason why he wrote this book and he wrote the series of books. So anyway, let me give you another number here. Let's give you 48. 48 will be our third number. All right, I keep saying he. I should put a dollar in the jar every time I say he. She is currently having fun with a paperclip. Yeah, I made a comment on Facebook, a couple of days ago. She spent an hour wrestling with a ballpoint pen on the floor. Um, so I made the comment, don't go to Amazon and buy all these fancy cat toys. Just throw a pen at them or a paper clip, and it's hours of fun for the kitty. So anyway, all right. So that's Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The last thing I wanted to do, and we can just kind of touch on this for a while, and you can read it in more detail on your own. But here are the responses to the fantasy analysis question. And two people did Avatar: The Last Airbender. Um, Very popular series, obviously, a wonderful example of fantasy. And so Mac did this. And I'm primarily interested, what I'm going to primarily focus on, you can read the other details. And of course, if you're not familiar with the story, it would help to read, the synopsis, etc. But particularly how the author, the creator of the work, makes the fantasy believable. Okay. Um, and Max says, while the story is a high fantasy, it still grounds itself in reality as much as it can be in the beginning. Right. So the beginning, there is a realistic section before we get into the fantastical aspects of it. Right. We do have a skeptic character in the story. And also, it has not only examples and qualities of great fantasy, but also of just general criteria for children's literature. And then Marin also did Avatar: The Last Airbender. And again, how does the author make it believable? It's based on the real world. The plot is extremely detailed and realistic. Um, the characters are believable. And the tone and style is also believable, and also has any number of qualities and characteristics of children's literature in general. Um, Whoops, well, I left off a name here. I'm so sorry. 11 Birthdays by Wendy Mass, which was one I was not familiar with, so I have to check this one out. This starts off in the primary world of Willow Falls, but slowly reveals these fantastical elements and has a time loop. The main character also doubts her surroundings at first, before eventually realizing Leo is also pulled into the time loop. And so, you know, the main character is a disbeliever, but when she believes, we'll believe too. Bailey, and again, I'm sorry, when I copy and paste these, I can't always paste the name, and then I usually add it, but I forgot to. So I apologize to the student who did 11 birthdays. Bailey did Monsters Inc. Love that story. Um, she actually kind of has some criticism here as far as believability. This story is not believable to any adult watching. However, some children may find it possible that monsters hide in the closet. But isn't that, part of every kid's nightmare, or maybe you felt like that when you were a kid? Um, at night, you always maybe had your parents check under the bed or check in the closet just to make sure there weren't any monsters there. Um, and she says this movie can help children become familiar with plot structures, expand their imaginations, appreciate and learn about art as it is an animated movie, and empathy and friendship is emphasized. Lauren did Coraline, which is another favorite of mine. Um, High fantasy, a lot of themes, messages to the story. Um, there are some censorship issues. I'm glad you pointed those out. There are a few disturbing aspects to that story that might make kids a little bit scared. The author starts the story in Coraline's ordinary life. The fantasy elements don't appear until she has already been established in her real world setting. She is also, again, the character who is skeptical at first. When she goes into the other world the first time, she is amazed but untrusting. Um, Rich imagery, again, the best way to make a fantasy believable is describe things in such a way, in such a detailed and powerful way, using imagery, the different senses, that we buy into it. And she also pointed out the mythological archetypes in Coraline. Miranda did Wings of Fire, a series by Sutherland, which I was not familiar with. So again, one of the reasons I have students do this, and one of the benefits for me is that I can learn about works that I'm not familiar with. Although we're not eased into the fantasy world, Sutherland is very vivid and detailed when it comes to setting and describing the world. There are familiar creatures that we all are familiar with. Um, Changes in the characters and the setting stay consistent over the course of the different books in the series. Um, and it also has other qualities like it allows them experience escaping into a fantasy world, helps stimulate and expand their imagination, also appreciate the artwork. Um, Now, Anam and Sophia both did How to Train Your Dragon. And of course, there was the classic that came out in 2010, and then there is the more recent, I think it's live action version, is it not? So um, there is their analysis. I'm curious to know if anybody loved the 2010 version and has seen the recent version, if you have any comments about that and your preference. It could be a paper topic, by the way, thinking about paper topics. Lydia did When You Trap a Tiger, um, based on a Korean folktale and myth. Connor did Dune, which Connor notes that this would be uh, probably at the tail end of our age appropriateness. I think this is geared more toward, an older child of 12, 13, 14, getting into young adult. But I think, uh, an advanced reader of 12 or 13, I think could get into Dune. Um, I'd be curious to know how Connor felt about the recent movie versions of Dune. There was one that came out, what, in the 80s, I believe, and then they remade it uh, with Zendaya. Is it Zendaya? Yeah, Zendaya, I'm sorry. I'll watch anything that she's in. Um, Very powerful. Dune borrows from a lot of things, including mythology. Uh, Olivia did Encanto, wonderful evaluation, particularly of the age appropriateness in the story. And again, you know, what makes me pick this really good fantasy work versus, 1,000 other really good fantasy works? Well, does it also achieve some of the other qualities and criteria that we're looking for? And in this case, Encanto meets a lot of those. Let me give you another number, 48. 48, third number. I was hoping somebody would do Harry Potter, but I was hoping, not all 18 people would do Harry Potter. But Anna did do Harry Potter. Uh, Definitely an example of high fantasy, as she points out. Consider this book appropriate for sixth grade. Uh, Censorship issues. I think I mentioned this in passing. I don't know when, but um, when Harry Potter first came out, it was very controversial because magic was used and so on and so forth. And it was on banned or challenged book lists. But I think over the years, uh, even its critics began to see that the book had positive messages for children. And the criticism, that aspect of the criticism kind of died down. Of course, you know, the the things that Rowling has done and said in her personal life in recent times is a whole other issue. But um, and this always, I don't know how you feel about this. This always raises the question to me. And if we had time in a classroom situation, sometimes we kick this around. But the question, and this would be for any literature major or English major or somebody who enjoys the arts or movies or music, or she just jumped. The question is, can you appreciate the work of the artist if the artists themselves are horrible, terrible people? And it's an interesting question. Um, can you still enjoy the Harry Potter books if you vehemently disagree with Rowling on things? And this is a question that comes up again and again and again. Um, some of our greatest artists of the past weren't nice people or did terrible things. And can you still appreciate their music or their art or their movies? I guess my best example that everybody can relate to, I suppose, um, is Bill Cosby. I mean, I grew up with Bill Cosby. I love Bill Cosby. I even saw him live once. Very funny. And of course, he had the classic family sitcom of the 80s, and he was America's Dad, you know. And that show is still rerun somewhere on some cable network. And we later found out that he was just a horrible human being who did terrible things to women. Now, the question then becomes, I don't know. Can you still watch The Cosby Show and enjoy the episodes of The Cosby Show, knowing what a horrible individual he is? He is still alive, isn't he? Is he still in jail? I hope he is. Um, can you separate the two, or can you just, you know, you can't separate the two? And there's any number of examples of that. That's just one prominent one. I mean, can you still enjoy watching an episode of The Cosby Show, knowing that Bill Cosby uh, was a horrible abuser of women? And again, that's not a topic for a group of kids, but give me some feedback on that if you'd like in a future email. How do you feel about that? I mean, do you have favorite musicians who they are or were terrible people, but you still enjoy their music or their songs or whatever? Um, I, you know, another one just pops into my head, Eric Clapton. I've always appreciated Eric Clapton as one of the great guitarists of all time, and I love some of his songs. Um, but over the years, he's said in some really awful things. Um, can I still listen to Wonderful Tonight and enjoy that song without thinking about, what an ass Eric Clapton is? I guess that's something maybe we do on a case by case basis. I don't know. So I'll leave that up to you. But anyway, I really went off track there. Sorry about that. Meanwhile, Chelsea is not impressed. She's saying, get on with it. Just get on with it. Okay. I'm sorry. But that usually is a conversation point at some point in a class like this. I usually bring it up in my Lit for Young Adults class because that's maybe a little bit more relevant to age appropriateness. But anyway, let me give you another number, 92. 92. I get my numbers in. So anyway, sorry, Anna, I went off track here, but she does a wonderful job of analyzing Harry Potter. Um, and there are censorship issues with Harry Potter. Caitlin did Finding Dory, another wonderful story for kids. Up, Naira did Up. When I read hers, I thought, I got to watch this again. I love this. Um, Probably one of my favorite first, 15 minutes of a movie ever. It's a wonder. I don't know that the movie lives up to that beginning, but it's a wonderful beginning. And if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about, so I won't give anything away. Um, and oh, Claire did Frozen. Uh, Again, very, 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 very popular fantasy of recent years. And she says it's actually super believable. The characters are all quite flawed, but the main reason is because Elsa's powers are hidden. They exist, but they're hidden. It's kind of like Harry Potter. It could be real, and we would never know it. The townspeople are in shock of the magic too, like people in real life would be. So they're kind of the disbelievers in a way. Also, the flaws of this world with the beautiful animation really make it come to life. It feels like people who might really exist with enchanting scenery that makes you so engrossed in the film, you forget about reality. So that's the nature of great fantasy, isn't it? To do those things. All right. So I thank you all. If I don't have yours, is because maybe they came in a little bit late or whatever, but that's a really good sampling of what we had. And again, I continue to be impressed on the effort that you do into these assignments. And we all benefit from your analysis. And I'm hoping too that in some cases when I go over these, it'll do for you what it does for me. So you may come across a title that's like, oh, I never heard of that before, but I'm reading the analysis of it, and it sounds like something I'd like to read or I'd like to see. Um, so hopefully that happens when we do this. Um, all right, that is it. We only had 4 numbers. That's how short our assignment was. And I'll end with, yeah, you're on camera. We'll end with Chelsea grooming herself. If she starts to groom herself in certain places, I'll have to censor, but no, she's gonna lick her tail. All right, enough of her. I'm the star of the show, damn it, not my damn cat. By the way, do any of you have cats who chase their own tails? I mean, that I used to think cats are really a really smart animal. Then you watch them like play for an hour with a paper clip or chase their own tail, and you think, well, maybe I still am a little bit smarter than this animal. I'm not nearly as cute though. She looks like she's about to get into nap mode. Well, anyway, there's our Chelsea cameo for the day. All right, thank you all. Have a good week, and we will then see you in our next video on Thursday. Until then, thanks everybody.